92.7. 92.7. 92.7.
92.7. 92.7. WVHS FM.
Captain Adam's Happy Hour.
On 92.7 WVHS FM. WVHS FM.
Captain Adam's Happy Hour.
Ladies and gentlemen, you are on WVHS FM 92.7, and welcome to Captain Adam's Happy Hour. I am Captain Adam of Captain Adam's VHS pirate ship. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you all are well out there, because we are well in here. Hopefully you listened to the last episode. In that, I talked about the latter year VHS, the final era of the VHS empire between the years 2004 and 2006. Most specifically, we talked about a history of violence on VHS, Batman Begins, The Legend of Zorro, stuff like that, and the outrageously high prices they go for nowadays. It's a very interesting part of VHS, part of the VHS world, because we don't really think of them as being that late in time, but they were. They were very much products of the new millennia. So we talked a little bit about that, and the conversation turned to how it never seems like you find any of those VHS from that era in thrift stores or anything like that. You never see them in the wild. And so that is why today, on today's show, we're going to be talking about thrift store VHS finds and ex-rental copies. If you're a VHS collector, then you know very well what I'm talking about. Unfortunately, you probably have never had an outlet to talk about it. And this is no different because, well, you're just going to listen to me talk about it. So, yeah, on today's show, we're talking about thrift store VHS finds and ex-rental copies. Pretty excited because we're going to have author and thrift store enthusiast Sandra Reynolds checking in to throw her 2 cents in on the subject. And, you know, we're going to talk about your common thrift store finds, thrift store stuff let me start over. Thrift store stuff that I've found that I never thought I would, and of course ex-rental copies of VHS, because some of them are pretty obvious that they were ex-rental copies, and some of them not so much. So you probably have a lot of ex-rental copies in your collection, if you have a collection, more than you know about. So we're going to talk about that. Very interesting show. And then later, I'm going to break into the beer, crack open a cold one with the, is it Tröegs? Is it Tröegs? Is it Tröegs? Well, I ask because there's a damn umlaut in it. Is it Tröegs? It's Tröegs, yeah. Tröegs Independent Brewing Company's Blizzard of Hops. We're going to try that beer and see how tasty that is. So stick around for some VHS talk, music, and beer.
There's no part of that sentence I didn't like.
It's going to be a good time. It has no choice but to be a good time. So stick around, and when we come back, we'll be talking about thrift store finds. So hang in there. We'll be right back. You are on WVHS FM 92.7, and you're listening to Captain Adam's Happy Hour. We'll be right back.
Captain Adam's Happy Hour.
On 92.7 WVHS FM. WVHS FM. 92.7 WVHS FM. Radio for the discerning VHS collector. WVHS FM. 92.7 WVHS FM. WVHS FM.
Captain Adam's Happy Hour.
Welcome back to the show. You are on WVHS FM 92.7, and you are listening to Captain Adam's Happy Hour. I am Captain Adam, and today we're going to be talking about thrift store VHS finds and ex-rental copy VHS. But right now, let's get the conversation started with thrift store VHS finds. That, of course, is VHS that you find in thrift stores or second-hand stores, if you want to call them that. That's what people used to call them. Now they're thrift stores. Somehow that made that switch. Sort of like how ping pong is now table tennis. But anyways, yes, thrift stores or second-hand stores are very highly trafficked areas for VHS collectors because there's always seemingly a large selection of used VHS for incredibly cheap prices. Some places sell them for a quarter or 50 cents. Some places go as high as $1. Some places do go higher than $1, but not much more than $2. I think that's a little pricey for what it is. Kind of takes the romance out of the thrill of the chase. Because, well, part of the fun of thrift store hunting is getting stuff for very cheap prices. And half the time, if not all the time, when a store sells used VHS, they're simply trying to get rid of them because what are you supposed to do with them? If you're not a collector, they take up a lot of room and they're really hard to get rid of. So you want to price them very cheap so they're attractive and people just buy them, not really knowing why they're buying them. They just buy them. So it certainly hones in on the instincts of the VHS collector. When a tape is only a quarter, it really doesn't matter what it is. I mean, I've found some goofy stuff on my journeys throughout thrift stores. A lot of religious tapes. That's there's always these religious tapes that certain churches or organizations would make based on like either biblical stories or stuff from the Torah or Mormon tapes. I came across a few of them recently. Mormon stories from the Book of Mormon that are animated, and they're interesting to have because they didn't make a lot of them. They were very low production because they were usually just sent to churches. So they're just there's not many of them. So they're pretty rare in and of themselves. Not that you would particularly get a lot of money for them if you were to try to resell them. I know I'm not going to try to sell them. I just wanted them because they're unique and rare, weird items. Weird being a neutral term. I don't mean to be disrespectful to anyone out there. They're just bizarre VHS things that you could only find in thrift stores. Nowadays, of course, if you were a member of that church or tabernacle, I'm sure they had it available, but I'm talking about aftermarket. So I wouldn't pay more than a quarter for that. So I only have, there's some things in my collection that I only have because I paid such a cheap price for them. And I'm sure it's the same case with you out there. If you're a VHS collector, and if you are a VHS collector, then I'm sure that most of your collection more than likely came from a thrift store in one form or another. And not only thrift stores, there's also a lot of used bookstores that do tend to sell VHS. I know there's one in my area that has a ton of VHS, but nothing really all that spectacular. And that's my next point. With thrift stores, I've been doing the thrift store thing for, I don't know, maybe about 15 years now. And I've noticed within the past, maybe 7 years, maybe 6 years, there's been a drop, a substantial drop actually, in the material and the amount of VHS that's out there in secondhand stores. You just don't seem to find those gems you used to be able to find. I remember one time, many moons ago, in the same day at the same store, I found a copy of Robot Holocaust and Hobgoblins for a quarter each. And then, I turned around and I sold them on eBay for way more than a quarter. I'll just say that. But you know what? I wish I didn't sell them. I wish I still had them because they were very unique finds for a thrift store. They were like trophies. And a lot of this stuff is like trophies. You're almost trophy hunting out there because it sort of becomes like what you can find at a thrift store. And I've noticed that, like I said recently, there really doesn't seem to be that much of a what's the word I'm looking for, of a selection. It seems like the secondhand VHS market is being slowly whittled down because, well, I guess everyone's bought it all up, and what you're stuck with is, of course, Jerry Maguire and Titanic, Independence Day. There's lots and lots of common thrift store finds, and it's almost its own joke with the amount of Jerry Maguire VHS that's out there. I just went to a thrift store today, and they had 3 copies of Jerry Maguire. Again, they also had Titanic. That's another one, very common. And I've noticed the Jim Carrey film Liar Liar. That's quite a popular one nowadays. It's sort of becoming the new Jerry Maguire. There's a lot of them that you see many of. Some of them they're not as mediocre as Jerry Maguire or whatever. You see a lot of Jurassic Park. You see a lot of 1989's Batman, stuff like that. Sometimes you see a lot of Batman Returns. So there are some pretty cool common thrift store finds, especially if you're a new VHS collector. It's a excellent springboard to get your collection going in the right direction, you should say. But there's also times when I found some things that aren't common, but somehow are common on thrift store shelves. Like there was one store I went to that had not one but 2 copies of Glengarry Glen Ross on VHS. I just thought that was a very strange. It's a fine film, of course. I bought one of them because now I have that in my collection. I just had to have it. But it makes you wonder who. Like I said, it's a good movie. If you haven't seen it, check it out. Who would buy it though? Somebody bought it twice. Well, let me rephrase that. 2 people had to buy it brand new, and they donated it to a thrift store. So it's the kind of movie you don't buy, but you rent, sure, but you don't buy it. It just seems odd that somebody did, let alone 2 people. So yeah, that's just an example. There's lots of uncommon, common thrift store finds. If that makes any sense. They're just movies, VHS you wouldn't think you'd find in a thrift store. Movies that you wouldn't think anybody bought at one time, and they're now on a thrift store shelf. Like I found Home Alone 3. Who bought that? I don't know, but I think thrift stores, secondhand stores, whatever, very fascinating because you wonder what is the story behind the VHS collections they receive? Because I'm guessing they get them in by the box load. People just donate their VHS collections, or at least their once VHS collections, because they just don't want them anymore. And you just wonder, well, what is the story there? A very eclectic taste. Another thing I find a lot of are like sports bloopers. I don't know where you guys are at on sports blooper VHS. Depending on what era they're from, I will pick one up. I do have a few of them. A recent find of mine, I think it was from '87. It's Bob Uecker's World of Sports Bloopers. So it's a blooper reel, a sports blooper reel hosted by the famous Bob Uecker. I thought that was pretty neat. Had to have that one. Depending on what region of the country you're in, or you will find a lot of hunting VHS about like hunting, big buck country and stuff like that, and Turkey Shoot 2001, stuff like that. It's a lot of just bizarre stuff that's more than likely going to stay there on that shelf until that store either burns to the ground, heaven forbid, or closes its doors, heaven forbid, again. Nobody is buying that stuff. They might as well just throw it away now. But, you have to try, because you never know, even though the odds aren't that good of somebody buying big buck country, the chances are still there. So thrift stores, secondhand stores, whatever you want to call them, a very interesting, fascinating aftermarket realm of VHS collecting. It is a source of many VHS collectors, if not all of us. But of course, there's much more to thrift stores than VHS. And with us right now on the phone is thrift store enthusiast and author Susan Reynolds. She is author of the book One Man's Trash, a survival guide to thrift stores and flea markets. Sandra Reynolds, welcome to the program.
Oh, well, it's my pleasure. You're very welcome. I'm always excited to talk about thrift stores.
And Sandra, I apologize. I called you Susan back there. My neighbor's name is Susan, and I talked to her before I came in to the studio, so she was on my mind for some reason. Sorry, I'm an idiot. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Sandra Reynolds, thrift store enthusiast and author of the book One Man's Trash, a survival guide to thrift stores and flea markets. Now, explain that title, thrift store enthusiast.
Well, I'm enthusiastic about thrift stores. I started off as a food critic, of all things, for the East Hamilton Herald, and that column slowly shifted from food reviews to lifestyle editorials, and well, eventually it just made the switch to talking about flea markets and then thrift stores, and now people just, for some reason, they value what I have to say on the subject.
Yes, and people should be interested in what you have to say because I've read through your book, One Man's Trash, a survival guide to thrift stores and flea markets, and it's very insightful and very informative. Kind of gives you a peek behind the curtain when it comes to thrift stores, and really it's something that we don't really think twice about, but I suppose we should because it is rather interesting. The part about thrift stores not exactly being strictly charitable organizations, I found that interesting because I was always under the assumption that it was a vessel for charitable organizations. But in this book, you explain that that's not exactly the case.
No, it's not always the case. In fact, in my findings, there's really only two major humanitarian charity organizations. And I'm not going to mention any names, but I'm fairly certain everybody knows who they are. There's only two of them who are in the charitable game when it comes to the thrift store, as it is a perfect, well, you said vessel for their organization. And there's a lot of misconceptions when it comes to thrift stores. But yeah, back to that, there are a variety of smaller chain thrift stores that may be attached to local missionaries or local homeless shelters or any other kind of humanitarian cause. But many of them are simply just storefronts for people selling other people's crap, so to speak. The other misconceptions on thrift stores is that you're directly, well, if you shop at the charitable ones, that you're directly helping someone out of poverty by buying The Lion King on VHS or a Niagara Falls ashtray. That's not exactly how it works. You are, in a way, helping because a portion of the profits, the proceeds go to the organization. So, in a way, you are helping someone out of poverty in the easiest way possible, but not directly. So, if you're plopping money down for a bunch of Lawrence Welk vinyl, you're not exactly doing anyone any big favors, but in a way, you are.
But to me, that's fascinating because I've always sort of thought, or at least mused to myself, that hey, I'm actually doing a good thing here. While I'm standing there getting ready to buy my 7th copy of Terminator 2 on VHS, I always sort of slept better at night knowing that I was helping somebody in some way. But I mean, not as much as I originally thought. But it is nice to know that I'm still helping in some sort of fashion. You wonder how much of a proceed can be derived from a 50-cent sale, but that is what it is. Of course, the volume is what they rely on, I'm sure. Now, we all have our go-to items. That's items that we seek out in thrift stores, the ones we go to first. Mine, of course, are VHS. And reading through your book, it seems like yours is clothing, more specifically T-shirts. Is that correct?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. I love looking through the T-shirts. It's important to point out that I've been to thousands upon thousands of thrift stores in basically every state in the United States, and it's always fascinating to find out what they have, because a lot of the T-shirt supply they have is made up of promotional items from local radio stations or local events, and many of them are 5 years older or 5 years or older. So it's like the little pieces in time. Now, the best thing I've ever found was a Dollywood shirt from '88. That was the greatest find I've had so far. So that's very interesting. So you never really know what you find in the T-shirt rack. As far as clothing goes, I do stay away from pants because those are pretty much nightmares on the rack. Because despite that they've been cleaned thoroughly, now they're supposed to do that. Whether or not they actually do that is neither here nor there. But wearing somebody else's pants, washed or not, is still a very odd and sort of creepy thing to me, because you don't know what kind of horrors have happened in those pants, and I just don't want any part of that. I will buy new pants. Thank you very much. I simply stick to the T-shirts, and I also look through the jackets as well. But it's also worth mentioning that I do look at everything in a thrift store to see what the ebb and flow is on their supply, as in what they're getting the most donations for, or what they're buying from people selling stuff to them. And I do look through the VHS thoroughly to see what's happening. And you're absolutely right. Jerry Maguire has to be number one, the most number one commonly found VHS, because I found multiple copies of Jerry Maguire on practically every thrift store shelf that I've been to.
Well, I absolutely agree with you 100% on the pants thing. I don't even bother because there's a lot of things that can go wrong in the pants area for human beings, so I just sort of stay away from them. Now, you said you check out VHS as well. Have you noticed the same way I have that the influx of the supply is dwindling down very, very much so in recent years, as in they're not getting a lot of VHS in anymore, and in some cases, a lot of the thrift stores that I frequent, they've stopped selling them altogether. What do you think is behind that? Do you think people are finally getting rid of their collections and it's a done deal and they don't have anything else to give? Or do you think a lot of people are now aware that VHS can be worth something, so they're sort of holding on to them? What do you think is the cause of that?
Well, I think mainly people they don't have VHS to give anymore. A lot of people have managed to successfully get rid of their VHS collections. I think that's a large part of it. As far as the stores not wanting to stock VHS anymore or accept them, that's just a very foolish thing on their part, because that's a profit. I mean, even if they don't sell very well, there's still a possibility of them selling. So for a thrift store to deny anyone giving them VHS that's just poor business on their part. I think people just don't have VHS left. They've given them all away, or thrown them away, or whatever other fate happened to their VHS collections. As far as like the selection being very slim, I think a lot of people are very much aware to a certain degree of what they really have, and I think people are starting to view VHS tapes as antiques, even though maybe there's a great refusal for our minds to really consider that, but they are antiques, and I think a lot of that denial comes from the fact that we don't want to consider ourselves old when we very much are. So I think people are eventually they're starting to come around to the fact that VHS are more than just bench warmers, so to speak, more than just obsolete technology. There is some value in them, and I think the people that would have the quote unquote good stuff to begin with, like your horror movies, your sci-fi movies, older stuff, more interesting stuff, wrestling tapes, anything to that degree. I think anybody who would have that to begin with isn't going to give that up to a thrift store or like a secondhand bookstore or something. I think they hang on to it and sell it on eBay or Amazon at a later date. So I think it's a mixed. Let's see here. It's a mixed scenario where there is the dwindling supply is because of those two huge factors.
Yeah, same here. I think it's a mix of both. I think it's more people just realizing what they have and they don't want to give it up. The people that have given it up, because believe it or not, out there, to my listeners, there was a time when you could find some pretty decent stuff on a thrift store shelf. You could find horror movies, you could find sci-fi movies, you could find wrestling tapes. You could find all this stuff that's pretty sought after by VHS collectors nowadays. You could find this stuff, but this was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, within that span, long before word got out that VHS might be a little bit more than just obsolete home media. So there was a time when you could find half decent stuff, and that's not to say you still can't find it. It's all luck. I would say the chances of finding anything half decent, very slim. I'm not an odds maker, but I would say from what I found, and Sandra, you could probably back me up here. I would say the odds 100 to 1, maybe even 1,000 to 1 of finding something like, I don't know, Return to Horror High on VHS or The Blob or any of the Friday the 13th, Hellraisers, stuff like that. I think the odds are very slim because people just realize what they have. And now the same for thrift stores being bastions for VHS collectors, they also are for vinyl, vinyl collectors as well. What's your experience been with the vinyl records in thrift stores?
Yes, thrift stores are an excellent source for vinyl collectors, but again, it's the same scenario where it's just not as good as it used to be because they are very much picked over, and people do realize what they have, and they're not so willing just to give them up to a thrift store. They want to sell them themselves. So I think the selection, of course, just like VHS, has dwindled down quite a bit because people just aren't giving the stuff up anymore. And with vinyl, you got to have a lot of patience because, of course, they don't organize their vinyl collections. So you need to really dig through them. And all I can say is lots of Lawrence Welk, a lot of classical music, just a lot of stuff that you might not very much be interested in. And another thing, there's a lot of tips and tricks as far as thrift stores go. You need to check the condition. Now, a thrift store it's very much different than an antique store or even a flea market or a used bookstore because thrift stores don't check the condition of stuff, at least not very well. So if you're buying vinyl, always make sure the condition of the record is decent. The same is true for CDs or DVDs. And as far as VHS goes, I'm sure you know this, but it's also a common slip-up. Always make sure the tape that's in the sleeve or the case is the tape that you're buying, because in a lot of cases, the wrong tape will be in the sleeve. However that happens, it does happen. So always make sure, and of course, while you're checking that, check the condition of the cassettes and all of this, because there's a lot that can go wrong with secondhand stores, and while you're not paying a lot for the item, you still want what you pay for. So always check before you buy.
Yeah, that's good advice because that is something I foolishly have done many times in the past. Luckily, it hasn't bit me in the ass as many times as it should have because there is a heartbreaking story I found a copy of Mosquito, the sci-fi movie Mosquito. I get it home, open the sleeve, and only to find out that there's some kind of cartoon cavalcade Porky Pig Burbank video in there instead. So, however that happened, I should have checked before I even bought it. So we got to let you go here soon. We got to take a station break. Do you have any closing thoughts on thrift stores?
Yes, thrift stores are the ultimate barometer of what our society has bought in the past 20 years or so, and what also they find not worthy enough to keep anymore or have outgrown. And so it's interesting to see what people were at one time interested in or found was useful. So it's fascinating to see what people had bought at one time only to give it away to be sold again. So it's interesting to see what our culture really was into, and now they just don't want them anymore. But as the old saying goes, one man's trash is another man's treasure. And speaking of that, I am currently working on the follow-up to One Man's Trash, a survival guide to thrift stores and flea markets. It's called Another Man's Treasure, yet another survival guide to thrift stores and flea markets. So be sure to look for that. And that's about all I got to say.
Excellent way to look at that, because it is very true. Thrift stores are very telling about how our society moves as consumers. Well, Sandra Reynolds, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. We certainly hope to talk to you again sometime soon.
Well, thank you very much for having me on the show. I'll talk to you anytime you want me to. Take care, Captain.
Sandra Reynolds, ladies and gentlemen, thrift store enthusiast and author of the book One Man's Trash, a survival guide to thrift stores and flea markets. Well, we got to take a station break right now, but stick around, because when we come back, we're going to start talking about ex-rental copies and how you probably have more than you think you do in your VHS collection. You're on WVHS FM 92.7, and you are listening to Captain Adams Happy Hour. Stick around.
Captain Adams Happy Hour.
On 92.7 WVHS FM. WVHS FM.
telling me that this sucker is nuclear?
WBHS FM.
92.7. 92.7. 92.7.
92.7.
Captain Adam's Happy Hour.
On 92.7 WVHS FM. WVHS FM.
Captain Adam's Happy Hour.
Welcome back to the show. You are on 92.7 WVHS FM, and you are listening to Captain Adam's Happy Hour. I am Captain Adam, and we have been talking about thrift stores, thrift store finds, and more specifically, VHS thrift store finds. It's a fascinating realm to beef up your VHS collection if you are a collector. And if you're not a collector and thinking about getting into the hobby, it's a good place to start because it's dirt cheap. And you never know what you find. There is nothing more random than the VHS at a thrift store, though that's not always the case. In fact, you will find these same sorts of VHS on every thrift store shelf. There is that, but you do also find your bizarre items that you don't typically see everywhere. There's lots of stuff out there that, because of the really cheap price, makes you want to buy it. One thing I've noticed a lot of is there's oftentimes videotapes from art installations from museums. Of course, that's about the whatever artist and whatever art exhibit is there. And sometimes you do find these museum tapes that, of course, are very low run. I mean, it's definitely just regional. Certainly local to that museum, or at least maybe it tours with this exhibit. But the point is, they don't make a lot of those sorts of tapes. If you know what I'm talking about, then good. If you don't, I can't really explain it any better than that. But it is like these very rare tapes that, because they're only a quarter or 50 cents or maybe even $1, it's very appealing to buy something like that because it is one of a kind. It's a rare item. You don't see it all the time. I'm sure most of them were either lost or destroyed. So it is worth picking stuff like that up. Now, recently I haven't really found all that much, all that many gems, but I have in the past. I have found some horror movie stuff. I found I believe it's the first VHS distribution of Halloween. I think it's an 82 or 83 Media Home Entertainment distribution. It comes with the closed sleeve, so that's very early. But I sold it. Sold it for a lot of money. Glad I got the price I did for it, but I wish I would have held on to it because that's like I mentioned earlier, a lot of this is trophy hunting. It's like, oh, what did I find for a quarter? Look at this. It's the thrill of the chase, the invigoration of the hunt. It's like you never know what you're going to find. So half of that, going thrift store shopping is just based on the exhilaration of what you could find there. And it's all a matter of just simply, rummaging through all the crap, so to speak. And, the prices, makes it certainly appealing to buy something that typically you wouldn't if you saw it on the open market. Because I have plenty of tapes that I really had no interest in even procuring had it not been a quarter or 50 cents. A lot of the other stuff I found a lot of early Warner home video VHS, the ones that come in their famous black clamshells. That's one of the most, I'd say, one of the more famous container designs of the romantic era of VHS. That's from like 81 to 86. So every time I see one of those, I tend to pick them up, no matter what it is. I found some pretty decent ones when it comes to that, like the original Blazing Saddles release. Let's see. I found It Lives and It Lives Again, on the same day. Obviously, it was from the same donor from their VHS collection. I found the Yakuza. Stuff like that, so every time I do find one of those, I do pick them up because I am a fan of that case. And I know some collectors who just collect those exclusively, the early romantic era Warner home video tapes. I've never found anything in the MGM book boxes. Stuff like that. The same goes with the big box designs. You always hear about that. USA Home Video was famous for using the big box design, horribly cumbersome and wasteful as far as the packaging design goes, but it looks pretty decent, and it definitely stands out with among the romantic era VHS. So, but I never find those, and that is because they're just so Well, I mean, they are kind of flimsy, and as time goes by, they're just going to deteriorate, especially the big boxes, because every time you open them, you seem like you destroy them a little bit more. So I don't think they even survive getting to the point of being donated. I mean, they just get trashed and they probably get thrown away. The same with the MGM book boxes; they just get torn or they come unfolded because they just don't hold up very well. So though they may look good, those packaging designs just weren't that efficient. So we'll do a show on that sometime in the future. But right now we're talking about thrift store finds, VHS thrift store finds. I have found plenty of goodies, but not as much as I would like to in recent years. You never seem like you find the old wrestling tapes like you used to. I used to find, well, I found, I should say, a lot of the late 90s WCW releases like Sting Unmasked and like Ric Flair's Greatest Hits and something about Hollywood Hogan, a Goldberg one, stuff that I really wouldn't buy on the open market, so to speak, but I would buy it if it was a quarter, and they were. So anything wrestling related, I always pick up. I have, managed to find one of the AWA wrestling tapes, one of their collections. They're actually really rare because they didn't make a lot of those, so they're scattered all throughout the country. So it's like, when you find something like that, you pick it up because why not? It's only a quarter or dollar or whatever, and it's there. You're never going to see it again. So just pick it up. But I don't find any of the old like Coliseum home videos, any of the old WWF like big box releases. Of course, that's Coliseum home video. Like, nothing like that. I don't. I wish I did. I wish I found more of them. But I think that is certainly a case where people who have that stuff realize what they have, and they're not going to give it up to a thrift store. So, and I don't blame them for that whatsoever, because I mean, wrestling tapes, anything wrestling related it's just really hot, and especially when you have stuff like that where it's like a cross collector's market, or excuse me, where you have like wrestling oriented VHS, because it's going to appeal to the wrestling collector and the VHS collector. The same is true for anything about video games. If you remember correctly, they used to make tapes about like, tips and tricks for certain video games. And, that was pretty big. So if you find any of that stuff, definitely pick it up as well. But you're never going to find it because, again, that's a cross-collecting market thing where it's about video games, and anything about video games, especially retro gaming, very hot right now. And you get the retro gamer collectors, then you get the VHS collectors. So nobody's going to give that up to a thrift store anymore. That's not to say they didn't, because I know I did see a few tapes years ago, maybe 15 years ago, and for whatever reason I didn't get it. I guess because I'm a moron. Yes, that's more than likely the reason for that. And here's a little trick too. Something that I've learned, most certainly the hard way, is always check the kids' DVD. Now, if you're a VHS collector and you go to thrift stores a lot and you see, you rummage through their VHS, and you know that pretty much all of them separate their tapes between what's in the normal sleeves and then what's in the kids' clamshells, like the Disney movies and all the family movies and all that stuff. Now, I would say 90% of that stuff is crap you don't want. But it's always worth checking because you can find some pretty interesting stuff. For example, one of the thousands upon thousands of Night of the Living Dead VHS distributions was actually released in a kid's clamshell. And what these thrift stores do is, of course, they don't like look through them and organize them in any sort of way, really. They just sort of like put the cases together. So if anything's in a kid's clamshell, doesn't matter what it is, they're going to put it with the other kids' clamshells. So here you have a movie that really that has no reason being in a kid's clamshell. So it's going to be with the kids' movies, but it's most certainly not a kids' movie. And there's other stuff too, like they released the Superman in a kid's clamshell, Never Ending Story, like just a bunch of stuff. It's worth it to look. Because you never know what you're going to find. There is interesting stuff in the kids' movie sections of thrift stores, so always check that out. Because, like I said, you never know what you're going to find. That is the name of the game when it comes to thrift stores. And you never really go into a thrift store with a solid objective, just a very loose objective on what you're looking for, but you never know what you're going to find. That's the same is true for used bookstores, flea markets, any place that sells old VHS. Old, of course, it's old, but you know what I mean. Any aftermarket VHS seller, it's always worth checking out their selection because, again, you never know what you're going to find. But one thing you can always guarantee on finding in thrift stores is ex-rental copies of VHS. Now, of course, what I mean by that is sort of obvious. There are VHS that used to belong to video rental stores and for whatever reason ended up on a thrift store shelf. Typically, this happens because a video store, let's say, went out of business, or they got rid of all their VHS stock when the VHS empire fell and DVDs became en vogue, or simply like I mentioned earlier, a video store closes and they sell off their tapes, or they simply just give them away or throw them out, and they end up in a thrift store or in the hands of a private collector who would later donate them to a thrift store. So, ex-rental copies, you do find at least a couple every time you go to a thrift store because they're very much still in circulation. Now, you can usually tell what an ex-rental copy is because a lot of video stores would essentially destroy the original sleeve to fit it in their own little cases. Typically, your standard hard plastic clamshell, they would just like slip the destroyed sleeve into the plastic covering of it to let you know what it is. And of course, they also have a bunch of stickers on it that say "Be Kind, Rewind" or the rating of the movie or whatever video store it was from. But sometimes it's not as obvious to where it's just a normal sleeve, and you really don't know until you take the tape out of the sleeve to reveal a bunch of stickers on it that again say "Be Kind, Rewind," or they give you the category of movie it is, or some kind of category number, or again, of course, the name of the video store it came from. But that too, that's not always a guarantee because sometimes it doesn't have anything on it. So you could very well have an ex-rental copy of VHS that you don't assume it is. Yeah, and also, again, sometimes it's very obvious it was an ex-rental copy. A lot of video stores would use different methods. Of course, what I mentioned earlier, the classic hard shell casing. It's, not exactly a clamshell, but, it's like a plastic case that opens from the front and what have you. But they would also use the old squeeze and shake cases. I'm sure you're familiar with that. It's just pretty much like a plastic sleeve that goes over the actual tape sleeve. Oh, excuse me. Oh, God. Oh, excuse me. That came out of nowhere. It just goes over the plastic sleeve, and it's just a hard sleeve, essentially, a clear plastic sleeve that protects the tape and all that, and you have to squeeze it and shake it out. And of course, if you've used these things, it's almost impossible to get them out with any kind of ease. So a lot of video stores would use that method. And then of course, stores like Errol's, I'm sure you remember Errol's Video Club, they would use, especially for their earlier rental copies, they use this big red, I don't know what you want to call it. It's like a big red case. It was, it was almost huge, almost the size of a Neo Geo video game cartridge. It was just like this huge thing where the tape would just slip into it. It was this huge red case that was filled with gray styrofoam to protect the tape. Sometimes it had the picture of the movie on it, but then sometimes it didn't. It would just have a label that stated what movie it was. So the early Errol ex-rental copies, you could definitely tell what they are. And they're just neat because that's a piece in time. And every time I find those, and I do find them sort of frequently, I do try to pick them up, despite what movie it is. And usually it's something a bit crap, but I still like having them because, well, it's a place in time and like a time marker, and it's just a piece of history. It's nice to have. And then Errol's would later change to just red plastic cases, the standard cases that would have the destroyed sleeve stuck into the plastic casing on the front of it, but also with Errol stickers all over it and all this. So, yeah, sometimes rental copies, they're very easy to tell they're rental copies, sometimes not so much. but still very prevalent on thrift store shelves. And in fact, X rental copies such a huge part of VHS because you think about this. When VHS first began, in the late 70s, early 80s, and throughout that time, no one really could afford to buy VHS. I mean, the retail price on them was sometimes over $100 or $70 or more, depending on what it was. So no one was buying VHS. But instead, who bought VHS was rental stores. And of course, they would rent them to people for, cheap prices and all this. But a huge buyer in VHS and early VHS sales was primarily rental stores. So, of course, you're going to have, for your aftermarkets, there's going to be a lot of X rental stock out there. So it's a big deal. It's such a big deal that when you list tapes on eBay, and it's probably the same for like Betamax or DVDs, it actually asked you, is this an X rental copy, yes or no? So it's one of those things that you have to let the customer know about, because some people don't like X rental copies. Well, for one reason, they've been through a lot of hands. It's one thing to buy a tape from a private collector who only watched it maybe once or twice, maybe more than that. But the point is, there was only one person that touched it. With X rental copies, VHS, lots of people have touched them, and they're just kind of, especially if you're a germaphobe. Well, if you're a germaphobe, you're probably not shopping in thrift stores anyway. But it is a worthy concern because you never know. I mean, things can get downright gross out there. So yeah, X rental copies. Some people are weird about them. Some people not so much. I don't mind them. It all depends on what it is, of course, and the condition of it. Because sometimes they are in some pretty crappy condition because they've been through a lot, and who hasn't, right? So if they look good, if they're a decent film, and they're really, really cheap, which they usually are, I will pick them up. In fact, I have a little spot on my VHS shelves reserved for the X rental copies in that standard plastic case. So I do have many of them. And so, yeah, where are you at on X rental copies? Do you like them? Do you pick them up? Does it depend on what it is? Or do you think they're gross? So let me know in the comments below. And so let's see here. Yeah, I mean, thrift stores, X rental copy, VHS, they sort of go hand in hand. And you will find at least one X rental copy on every thrift store visit you will ever embark upon. All right, well, we got to take a station break here, and when we come back, I'm going to break into the beer. Yep, beer review coming up, so sit tight, enjoy some tunes, and keep it locked right here to WVHS FM 92.7, right here on Captain Adams' Happy Hour.
Captain Adams Happy Hour.
On 92.7 WVHS FM. WVHS FM.
not want to touch his ass.
WVHS FM
92.7. 92.7. 92.7.
92.7. 92.7. WVHS FM 92.7. 92.7 WVHS FM. Radio for the discerning VHS collector. WVHS FM.
Captain Adam's Happy Hour.
You are on WVHS FM 92.7 and you are listening to Captain Adam's Happy Hour. I am Captain Adam, and welcome back to the show. We have been having an interesting discussion here today. We've been talking about thrift store finds, the VHS you find within the magical realms of thrift stores, and we've also been talking about ex-rental VHS, two things that go hand in hand. Now, one more thing about thrift stores, another thing you could commonly find on their shelves, as well as ex-rental copies, are ex-library copies. Now, that's VHS that belonged to a library at one point in time. And maybe you didn't know this, because I did not know this for the longest time, but a lot of libraries, if not all libraries, do have a section of, or at least did, have a section of VHS where you could check out the tapes, much like you would a book. And so, of course, when VHS went belly up, a lot of these libraries got rid of their VHS stock, and it would end up in thrift stores. And many times, of course, these library copies, or ex-library copies rather, would have a sticker on the tape declaring what library it was from. So that's also pretty interesting to come across those. Because much like the X-Rental VHS, the X-Library VHS more than likely has some pretty interesting stories to tell as well, because I'm sure they went through many hands. And of course, it's the same thing with the X-Rental VHS, where if you think about it hard enough, it does become sort of gross. But anyways, let's put all that aside and get into what makes this hour so happy. Let's get into the beer. And today's beer review, I'm going to be trying from Tröegs Tröegs Independent Brewing, Blizzard of Hops, a winter IPA. Now, of course, on its face, when you hear winter IPA, you're probably assuming that it's a very heavy beer, but you could be wrong in that assumption. Because you think winter, you think ooh cold. You want something hearty and thick to sort of warm you up, or at least give you the illusion that you're being warmed up, but really you're just getting drunk. But anyways, the name winter IPA or winter ale or winter whatever makes you think that it's going to be hearty and robust and especially with a name like Blizzard of Hops, I can only expect this to be very, very hoppy. So let's go ahead and get this bad boy cracked open. Let's let that breathe for a little bit. I don't have my draft glass with me today. I'm no longer allowed to have it in here because the last episode when we went off the air, I pretty much spilled it all over the mixing board, but it was okay. Nothing. It wasn't that much. Everything was okay, and I just picked up the mixing board and slurped the beer out of it. So it's all good. But either way, I'm not permitted to have draft glasses in here anymore because the spill the spill risk is too high because I'm an idiot. So right away, let's see. Take a peek into the bottle here. Again, this is another dark brown bottle, and it's often really hard to get a good picture of what the beer really looks like. Looks like, let's see, pretty. It's a nice light and rich golden color, not a pissy hue, so that's good. But I will say this right away: there basically is no odor. And that's sort of odd because it is. I mean, it's faintly hoppy, yes, but not as much as I would think with a name like Blizzard of Hops, because that makes it sound like it is just filled to the brim with hoppiness. And this, as far as the odor goes, that is not really there. So that's interesting. In fact, it smells rather light. But let's see here. Yes, Tröegs Independent Brewing. They got started in 1996 out of Central Pennsylvania. Now they operate out of Hershey, Pennsylvania. So they're one of the top brewers in the country. Tröegs Independent Brewing. I've had a lot of their products in the past. I think it's rather tasty. This though seems a little different than their standard stuff because it doesn't smell like a Tröegs product, but well, anyways, let's get a taste on this. Here we go. Well, gosh, this is it's not bad. I don't think it's bad. It's not. It's actually rather good, but it's surprising because I thought it would be a lot heavier than what it is. There's not even that much of an aftertaste. There's not much of a back end. There's not much of a front end. It's a rather light beer for being a winter IPA because, like I said, you do half expect winter beers to be heavy. This is not heavy at all. This is almost like a light beer, I would say. Let me get another drink here. Yeah, this is I don't know. I would not guess this was a winter ale or whatever you want to call it from the taste or the aroma. It is very light. It's very light. Let's see, it's got a 7.1% alcohol volume, so it is pretty hefty when it comes to that, but you cannot taste that in the actual beer. It is very light, rather refreshing, sort of reminds me of a summer ale as opposed to a winter ale. So again, I'm drinking the Tröegs Independent Brewing Blizzard of Hops, the winter IPA, and it is a little bit, almost a little bit too light and refreshing for what it's supposed to be. Now, it's not bad. It's actually rather tasty, very crisp, easy to drink. I would say that if someone was opposed to hoppier beers, they would really enjoy this, but they probably wouldn't bother to try it based on the name, because the name makes it sound like it's something more fierce and more robust than what it actually is. Blizzard of Hops, not really a fitting name for this beer. If it were heavier and hoppier, yes, but it is rather light and doesn't remind me of a winter IPA, but still, it's still very good. Yes, but if I wanted a winter IPA, I sort of would want something a little bit more heftier than what this offers. I can certainly see myself drinking a few of these because it is easy to drink and the alcohol volume will get the job done. But as far as like a winter ale, no, I don't think this is a winter ale. It is labeled as that, but that's a little misleading. A very light and refreshing winter ale. That is the Tröegs Independent Brewing Blizzard of Hops Winter IPA. I'm not saying I'm disappointed. I am saying I'm surprised because this was a little bit unexpected. I was expecting something very heavy, especially considering that I've tried the Tröegs products in the past, and they usually are rather hoppy and rather hefty. This almost seems like they didn't make this; somebody else did. But I guess they're doing something different. But again, not much of an odor. The aroma it is pleasant. It's not stanky, but it's also not very hoppy, and you really can't tell you're drinking a winter IPA. And the taste, very light and crisp, but does not remind me of a winter IPA. Sort of reminds me of a summer IPA or just a normal lighter IPA. The color is really good. I mean, there's nothing really wrong with this except for the name. I would say is a little misleading, but that's it is what it is. So there's that. Tröegs Independent Brewing. They are good. This was Blizzard of Hops. All their stuff is rather good. So check them out. Tröegs Independent Brewing, Blizzard of Hops, Winter IPA. Though it's called that, you may find that it is not very much a winter IPA at all. But Tröegs Independent Brewing, good company, one of the top brewers in the country. Check them out if you haven't already. They do have a very fine line of ales and whatnot. Very good stuff. Very good stuff. Well, that is going to put a bow on today's episode. Be sure to keep it locked right here to WVHS FM 92.7 and subscribe to Captain Adam's VHS Pirate Ship on YouTube if you haven't already. And just a word to my fans out there, the very few that I have. If you're wondering, no, the channel hasn't changed the format. The Captain Adam's VHS Pirate Ship channel has not changed its format. I will still be doing my normal shows like the Full Adventures, the Week of the Weeks. All the normal stuff will still be there. I'm just doing this little radio show just to do something different and kind of like New Year, a new show kind of thing to see how this works. But don't worry, the channel will remain the same. But in the meantime, definitely enjoy all the hip, cool programming on WVHS FM 92.7, as well as Captain Adam's VHS Pirate Ship on YouTube. Well, it's time to say Vio con Dios, and stay tuned right here to WVHS FM 92.7, and I will talk to you next time right here on Captain Adam's Happy Hour. Take care out there.
Captain Adam's Happy Hour.
On 92.7 WVHS FM. WVHS FM.